$212 is what is in the account on the 14th. Not the 1st, not the 31st, but the 14th, which is somehow the worst day of the month to look. You are too far from the last paycheck to feel good and too far from the next one to feel safe. You know the number is fine. You tell yourself the number is fine. And then you close the app without reading it. Because knowing and feeling are two different countries. And right now, you are living in both of them at once. This is not a story about being broke, because broke has a different shape than what you are carrying. Broke is empty fridges and disconnection notices. And this is something quieter than that, something harder to name. It sits inside a life that looks functional from the outside, because you go to work and you pay your bills. You have a streaming subscription and a gym membership you use just enough to justify keeping it around. Nobody looking at your life from the outside would call you broke. And yet the number is $212. Your body knows something your income statement does not. And that gap is what this is really about. It is 11:47 at night, and you are standing in the kitchen eating leftovers out of the container. Not because you are hungry, but because the kitchen is the one room where sitting still does not need justifying. The refrigerator hums, you picked up your phone 3 minutes ago, opened the banking app, and closed it again. The balance never loaded because you closed it before it could, even though the number was probably fine. You knew the number was probably fine, and you still could not make yourself look at it. That is not a budgeting problem. That is something older than a budget, something that lives below the math. Marcus does the same thing. Not the leftovers exactly, but the closing of the app before the number loads. He is 31. Works logistics management at a regional distribution center outside of Atlanta, and pulls in around $61,000 a year. His take-home lands around $1,847 every 2 weeks, after the government finishes its portion. He is not behind on anything. His credit score is decent, and he has a 401k at work. He enrolled because his HR person told him to during onboarding 3 years ago, and he has never logged in since. He has never once checked the allocation, never once looked at what the money is actually doing inside that account. He still has the debit card from the credit union his mother opened for him when he was 16 years old. He has thought about switching banks probably 400 times, and he never does, because changing it means admitting something. Changing it feels like admitting the original account was not enough, and that feels like saying something about the family that raised him. He is not ready to go there. So the card stays, and the account stays, and the feeling stays with it. There is a word in behavioral economics for what Marcus is doing, but that word is not really the point here. The point is what it feels like. And it feels like standing inside a house you built room by room. You built it carefully. You made it work. And you have never once checked whether the foundation is sound underneath it. Not because you are lazy, but because checking might confirm something you are not sure you can afford to know. The first floor of wealth psychology does not have a nice name, and some people call it survival mode. But survival mode implies a visible threat, and there is no visible threat here, because the check clears each time. The car payment goes through, the rent gets paid, and yet the nervous system has not received the memo that things are okay. The body is still scanning, still calculating, still preparing for the version of events where the money disappears without warning. Because somewhere back in the architecture of how you learned about money, it always did disappear, and the body remembers that. Safety and savings are not the same thing, but your nervous system votes otherwise, and it votes loudly every single time. You spend before you save Because spending now feels like certainty, while saving feels like trusting a future that has not proven itself. You buy the thing because the thing exists right now, and right now is the only time your body fully believes in. The result is a checking account with $212 on the 14th and a savings account you opened once. You opened it because a blog post told you to, deposited something small, and have not touched it since March. And underneath all of it is a low-grade financial anxiety you have lived with long enough to stop calling it anxiety. You have started calling it just how things are, which is the most expensive thing you have ever decided to believe. None of the personal finance content ever says this out loud, but most people are not on this floor because of math. The math would be fixable, and you know the math would be fixable because you are not bad at math. What keeps most people on the first floor is not the absence of information. It is the presence of a feeling. A feeling that information cannot reach. A feeling that lives below the level where articles and tips and advice can land. You are not going to fix that by reading something about index funds, because this is not an information problem. Something has to change one floor up, and the change does not look the way you expect it to look. Here is what Derek did. And Derek is 33, lives in Columbus, and makes almost exactly what Marcus makes. He saw a video at 2 in the morning about a Roth IRA, not because he was researching, but because he could not sleep. He was in a scrolling, half-present mood. The video was 9 minutes long, and something about it made the numbers feel real. They felt like they belonged to him, not to someone else's life, not to a different tax bracket, but to his actual situation. He opened the brokerage app that night, filled in his information, linked his checking account, and set up a monthly contribution. He did this for 4 months, which is long enough to feel like a habit and short enough to lose without noticing. Then his car needed a timing belt, $1,100, and he paused the automatic transfer to cover the cost. He told himself he would restart it in 60 days, which is the kind of promise that feels responsible when you make it. The brokerage app is still on his phone, sitting on the second screen, behind the food delivery apps, where it's settled. He has not opened it in 4 months. And Derek is not a cautionary tale. Derek is what the comparison floor looks like. Something did change for Derek between the survival floor and where he landed, because the paycheck got a little bigger. The apartment improved, he paid off one of the credit cards, and the anxiety did not disappear. It changed shape. Now there is enough money to make choices, and choices mean exposure, and exposure means you can be compared to others. He started watching what other people appeared to have, not with malice, not consciously, but with the quiet attentiveness of someone always measuring. The guy from high school posting about Vegas in April, the colleague with the new truck, his cousin closing on a house. And Derek does not know this, has no access to this information. But the guy from high school tells a different story. That guy has $4,400 in a savings account and $19,000 in credit card debt, sitting quietly. Derek has looked at that truck and that Vegas trip and constructed an entire financial biography out of visible signals and invisible assumptions. That biography is approximately 100% invention. And that is not stupidity. That is the comparison floor doing exactly what it was built to do. The comparison floor does not care how much you make. It only cares how much the person next to you appears to make. This is where the Roth IRA sits unfunded, not because Derek does not have the money, because he does have some of it. The IRS confirmed the contribution limit for 2026 is $7,500 for the year, which is $625 a month. That is real money. It is not nothing. but it is not unreachable at his income level if the other spending stops. The account sits unfunded because funding it is invisible. You put money away and nothing changes on the surface of your life. No one sees it, no one acknowledges it, and in an environment built entirely on visible signal, invisibility feels like falling behind. So you buy the medium thing instead. A dinner that was slightly too expensive, a jacket that was not strictly necessary, a weekend trip because you have been working hard and you deserve to feel like the kind of person who takes those trips. The medium thing costs $214. The Roth IRA remains at $0, and the gap grows by inches you will not measure until later. Marcus knows Derek vaguely through a mutual friend, and Marcus has a sister named Sandra who bought a condo at 31. He has never told anyone that her buying the condo made him feel behind rather than proud of what she accomplished. He does not understand why the feeling works that way. He suspects it says something unflattering about him, so he does not investigate. What it actually says is that he is on the comparison floor, and she has moved up, and watching that creates a specific ache. Watching someone from your exact starting point make the move you have not made yet does not feel like inspiration at first. It feels like a gap being measured. It feels like the question of whether the gap between you and her is permanent. The comparison floor is expensive in ways that never appear on a bank statement, and the cost accumulates without announcing itself. It cost you the Roth IRA contributions for 4 months. It cost you the $1,000 that went to something no longer memorable. That $1,000, if it had gone to the emergency fund, would have made the timing belt a minor inconvenience instead of a pivot point. It costs you the compound interest on the years you spent performing a financial life instead of quietly building one underneath the performance. Spending is the only financial action that feels like control when everything else feels uncertain, and that is why the spending keeps happening. There is a billboard Marcus passes every single morning on the way to work, a wealth management firm with a man in a suit. A city skyline, a professional photograph, a phone number he has driven past roughly 400 times without ever considering calling it. Not because the number is wrong, not because the service is bad, but because he does not believe the billboard is for him. That is not a marketing problem. That is the comparison floor telling you which rooms you are allowed to enter and which ones are not yours. The move from the second floor to the third does not happen through discipline alone, because you cannot willpower your way out of a feeling you have not named. What usually happens is something small and unglamorous, some version of looking at the number and deciding the performance costs more than you can afford. Nobody tells you that the third floor feels like grief, and that is the word that fits but never appears in the content about budgeting. It does not appear in the articles about automatic transfers or the videos about maximizing your 401k contribution up to the employer match. In 2026, the IRS employee contribution limit sits at $24,500, which is a number most people start by looking past. It functions less as a goal and more as a horizon line you register and then set aside while you figure out where to begin. You do not think about that number when you are on the third floor. You think about $60 a paycheck. You think about $100. The automatic transfer goes through on a Tuesday. Your account goes to $1,197 instead of $1,211, and you do not feel it. That is the whole experience. For a long time, you do not feel it, and no one tells you that is what success feels like at first. The emergency fund crosses $1,000, then $1,500. Then the $3,400 mark arrives on a Thursday in November. You are at work when the notification comes through. You look at it for 4 seconds, and you put your phone back in your pocket. There is nothing to do with the feeling except feel it. And the feeling is smaller than you expected it to be. You sleep slightly differently, and that is the entire reward for the first year, which is both less and more than you imagined. The comparison floor had noise, the survival floor had noise, and the third floor is quiet in a way that takes time to trust. Because quiet is not the same as safe. And your nervous system spent years in a building where quiet meant something was about to go wrong. Compound interest, lived from the inside, is the experience of doing a thing you cannot feel for long enough that the thing begins to work on its own. It is not a graph, it is not a projection, it is a Tuesday in November where the balance has grown by an amount you did not put in. Time put it in. Which means last year's version of you did something for this year's version of you. And that is a new kind of relationship with money. Marcus logs into his 401k portal for the first time since he enrolled 3 years ago during onboarding. It takes him 11 minutes to find the login credentials, and the allocation is sitting in a default fund he has never chosen or examined. He does not move anything yet. He just looks at the screen, which is the most financially significant thing he has done in 3 years. That is the third floor. You just look for the first time without closing the app before the number can load. Derek restarts the brokerage contribution. Not at $625 a month, because that number belongs to a different version of him right now. He restarts it at $80. Because 80 is what he can do without lying to himself about what is actually sustainable. And lying to himself is exactly what stopped him the last time. So $80 is not a compromise. It is a strategy. Discipline does not feel like progress. It feels like waiting in a quiet room for something to change. And yet, the change is already happening. That is the thing about the third floor that cannot be seen from the second one. The change does not announce itself. It just compounds. And this is the floor where the story either continues or breaks, depending on something that has nothing to do with the account balance. It has to do with whether you believe the amount in the account actually belongs to you. And that belief is harder to build than the balance. This is the thing about growing up in a house where money was always leaving, where the conversation about money was always about what was missing, where wealth was something that happened to other families, in other zip codes, under other circumstances that were clearly not the ones you were born into. That belief does not live in your thoughts, it lives lower than that, in the part of you that makes decisions before your thoughts arrive. Terrence from Marcus's high school looked wealthy. The truck was real, the trips were real, and the confidence read as financial ease from a distance. What it actually was debt held at a distance from consequence, a performance running on credit instead of on anything that would last. Marcus spent years quietly deciding that Terrence had a better job, or a side hustle, or a kind of luck that was not available to him. What Marcus never considered is that the confidence was the only real asset Terrence was spending, and it was not compounding. There is a room in the building of wealth psychology that most financial content does not want to take you to, because it is not optimistic in the way that gets attention. It does not promise a number, it does not give you a step, it just asks you one question and waits. When you imagine yourself with real money, a net worth that means something, an account balance that does not require a breath before loading, do you see yourself clearly? Or does the image blur at the edges? Does it look like someone else's life, set inside your imagination without quite fitting? The Federal Reserve's 2022 survey of consumer finances found that the median American household net worth sits at $192,700. That number includes home equity, retirement accounts, and everything else, and it is not a rich number. It is a real one. Somewhere inside of you, there is a version of that number that reads as possible, and a version that reads as belonging to someone else. Which version you hold is the single largest predictor of whether you stay on the discipline floor or quietly find a reason to leave it. Wealth compounds, and so does the belief that you are not allowed to have it, and both of them run on the same invisible fuel. The billboard Marcus passes every morning, the man in the suit, the skyline, the phone number he has driven past 400 times. On the 401st pass, he does not call. He does not suddenly feel the billboard was designed with him in mind. But for the first time, a thought arrives that has never arrived before, and the thought is not for him, yet, with the word yet doing all the work. Debt is a floor, and floors can be climbed, and the climbing starts before you can feel it starting. $212 on the 14th of the month, and the number has not changed. The account looks exactly the same as it did at the start. But the number was never really about how much money was left. It was about how much of the old story was left inside you. How much of the wiring from the house you grew up in, from the conversations you overheard about what money does and where it goes, was still running. Still running in the background of every financial decision you made without you knowing it was there, setting the terms before you could. The math is fixable. That has always been true. The math has always been fixable, and it will continue to be fixable. What takes longer is the part underneath the math, the part that closes the app before the balance loads, because looking feels like risk. The part that watches someone else's house close and feels the distance as proof of something permanent, rather than something temporary. The part that puts $80 a month into an index fund and waits in the quiet room and learns, slowly, that the money staying is not an accident. It is a decision you keep making, even when it does not feel like anything, especially when it does not feel like anything. That is the only question that matters at any floor of this building. Not how much do you have, not where do you want to be. Just this. When does the number stop feeling like a verdict, and when do you start feeling like the person who gets to decide?